This is not restless. Okay, I know you just want to get to the show, but I'm actually here to tell you that there's a way that you can get even more restless in your life. You can do that by going to patreon.com/the restless podcast, where there are 3 different ways, starting at just $3 a month, that you can both support this show and at the same time get even more content. At least 1 extra episode a week and often more. Not to mention the Restless Telegram channel that you'll have access to 24/7 to interact with all the other patrons. If you want more restless in your life, this is the way. Go to patreon.com/the restless podcast. Okay, back to the show.
This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless. This is your post-mortem on the young, restless, and reformed. I'm still here. I'm still your host, Matt Klein, and today I am drinking some apple cider and joined by Pastor Michael Bowman.
Well, that sounds really good. I am not drinking anything because I rushed to get here because we were in the middle of selling a pig. And so I probably look pretty grubby. I noticed, Matt, that I'm wearing nobody will see this, but I'm wearing a kind of grubby black t-shirt, all black t-shirt. You're wearing a white t-shirt. And So we've got that good contrast going on. But yeah, I'm not actually drinking anything, but we are back. That's exciting. I mean, we're so back. It's been a little while. We actually, even because we had a slight bit of a hiatus because of your own work in church planting and what you were doing there. And my family and I were on vacation for the last 2 weeks. And we had a listener named Micah who reached out to us, and he just said that, he was a big fan. He just wanted to check in with us since we haven't posted for a couple of weeks. And very funnily, he said, I mean, the TGC climate change debate episodes were pretty bad, but not bad enough to warrant quitting. He said, it's pretty funny. But then he just said he'd be praying for us in case anything bad happened. But no, Micah and everybody else, we are still here. We were okay. Just a busy season for Matt, and not as busy season for me, but pulling away from some things kind of a season. Honestly, the first real vacation we had in quite a while. So really pleasant for my family.
Pastor Michael, does this mean that next Monday night we will react to the amillennial, post-millennial debate that was 30 minutes long instead of another painful?
Was it only 30
TGC?
minutes?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, definitely want to watch it. So this is the Foskey one, right? Keith Foskey and Doug Wilson. Yeah. Somebody brought that up to me at church on Sunday in our Sunday school. Somebody said, hey, so do you know this guy that looks like Doug Wilson, and was debating him about amillennialism, post-millennialism? And I was like, Keith Foskey, yeah, he's on the podcast that Matt and I do. I was like, why aren't you listening? Like, come on. He's been on before. Anyway, no, I definitely we should do that on Monday. That sounds great.
Next Monday, I don't know what is 7 days from today as we record on a Monday, as I reveal some inside podcast life.
Is it the 18th?
The 18th. The 18th.
September 18th.
September 18th, 8 p.m. Central, a post-millennial pastor and a amillennial pastor will review a post-millennial pastor and an amillennial pastor debate. And by the way, from the part I watched, really casual, barely a debate.
Yeah. Which, of course, yeah, I knew.
Yeah, for 30 minutes, you know. But it will give us plenty to, I'm sure, enjoy and talk about, though it will be put me in an awkward position to be on the side of the Baptist in this circumstance. But it will put you on the side of the accused federal visionist. So that is, perhaps I am in the better company.
We're both bad guys. We're both.
But today, Pastor Michael, we need to do what at one time people loved this show. There was a season of time where people loved this show where we discuss the rise and fall of things. Not this thing, but another thing. Um, and the thing we are discussing, the rise and fall of today, is the rise and fall of the evangelical elite. Because friend of the show and now internet controversialist guy, Stephen Wolfe, has written an article on the rise and fall of the evangelical elite. And there are a lot of things about the article that I think are very good. I think as far as like a here's a brief summary of how of of charting out this people's experience with New Calvinism, the Young Restless and Reform movement, the people that they looked up to, and the times where people started jumping off board. I think it is very accurate. I think he's looking back with very specific reasons, and I think that it will give us some good stuff to talk to. But yeah, Pastor Michael, let's just start with the most broad question. In general, do you believe that the evangelical elite has fallen? And I'm asking you that. I'm giving you it as broadly to define those words as you desire.
Yeah. So that's really the question, right? What are we talking about? Like,
Uh
who
huh.
really is the evangelical elite? So if you follow this article, and you'll link to it, and people
Yes,
can
I will.
go read it and see it. Honestly, the vast majority of it is almost just a history.
Hmm.
It's just
It is.
walking through the history of the Young, Restless, and Reformed, more or less. And there's definitely some, it's being done from a particular vantage point, but it's mostly just straight line. This happened on this date. Here, here's when Together for the Gospel started. Here's when these things began. Here's when they ended, etc. And so a lot of it is just the stuff that we've talked about quite a bit already at different times.
Yep.
But if so from that vantage point, when he says the evangelical elite, he is talking specifically about the guys that we talk about all the time, right? So
That's right.
he's talking about the guys who were heavily involved in Together for the Gospel Coalition, these sorts of organizations. And if we follow, for instance, another friend of the show, Brad Vermerlin's thesis that the Young Restless Reform was basically the move to take the center of evangelicalism, take the leadership in a sense within evangelicalism, and kind of define the boundaries. And if they were actually successful at that, and I think we basically think they were pretty successful on a popular level. I don't know that it was like when it was all said and done, that they took it all, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's such a broad, weird movement within American Christianity that it's just hard to say. But they at least took a significant portion of the leadership within broader evangelicalism. And in so in saying evangelical elite, it's talking about those guys. It's talking about the people you see on stage at Together for the Gospel, the kinds of guys that were heavily involved in the Gospel Coalition. Have they fallen? I think it. I am basically on the fence in this regard. I
Mm,
think that they've fallen in the sense that they do not have maybe the same popularity amongst the young men that maybe they marketed to most originally.
sure.
The people like us, right? People like us who now do reviews of TGC debates to mock them,
Right.
and not just to mock them, by the way. Hopefully to be constructive too. But as Micah pointed out, maybe sometimes it's just not not the best content. Um, but I mean, that's what we do, and we are honestly, I think we're pretty mild mannered. I know not everybody thinks that, but I think we're pretty mild mannered compared to the kind of reaction that like TGC gets when it posts anything
Right.
on Twitter or YouTube or wherever. But that being said, I still think that there are large portions of the evangelical world that are not involved in that at all, right? The people that are not on Twitter, they're not following a lot of these up and coming voices, who are more or less just capturing certain audience from these organizations. But like just the regular, suburbanite women that are reading articles on the faith on the Gospel Coalition. That I still think that's a pretty large amount of people. And so I don't know. So that's what I would say. I don't actually know if they've fallen. I do think that especially, and he gets into this in the article, I think post-COVID, there's a lot of shifting that has gone on, and I don't think that's worked out yet. I don't think things are settled in that regards. And so I do think that there's clearly a falling out of almost all elites. I mean, just there's a general distrust of any kind of elite in any position, including on local levels, by the way, including on like local pastors. Like that's happening too. And so it's definitely happening in the online and greater evangelical world.
Yeah. Here are my 2 reasons to believe that I think the sign that they've fallen, and these are both based on my own experience. So these are, use that as much or as, with as much or as little credibility as that brings, right? The first one is, obviously, one of the main reasons we started this show is because we and many others like us were deeply influenced by these people and then moved on at some point. And people for different reasons. Obviously, we have promoted what we think is a healthy reason to embrace the historic Orthodox Christian faith that is found in the Reformed churches, right? There are other people that moved on, split from various things, but there was this growing dissatisfaction that something wasn't working. 2, and this is maybe what you're getting at, why you're kind of going back and forth. I do think these kinds of people and institutions still do have actually a pretty large role, specifically in online Christianity. But what I've realized is if you aren't in they were trying to take the center of Christian evangelicalism. I don't think they have that anymore. Now I think what they have the center of is online Reformed guy or woman, like, or whatever, Christianity. Because when I talk to, obviously as a church planter, when I talk to people outside of that, they play zero role.
Yep.
The controversies that we celebrate Kevin DeYoung taking on or whatever, they don't care about.
Yep.
Right? They don't, and they are unlikely to be interested in any of these things going on. And that's where I think the fall is. And so I think they are now back in the Reformed guy world. And now that they are not, and we'll cut to this later, now that they are not the like without question leaders that they were, there's now a further openness of questioning them, right? Obviously, some people think we go too far, but I think, you and I try, like, there were people trying this, right? This is why even people kind of in this group, like John MacArthur, questioning Driscoll in 2009 was seen as so negative. That was just insane that someone would call into question what was happening. Now, 2 people like you and I who have nothing, we can call into question an entire series TGC did in order to inform Christians on various positions they could take.
Yeah.
And there might be people who think we laugh too hard, but in general, people are like, this is good. This is helpful to me as I think through these things. And I don't think that would have been welcomed at all based on how the kinds of even well-known people who are doing that a decade ago were treated.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the reasons I said I'm not so sure is because, and you kind of touched on it, but because there's still outside of the more maybe hardcore conservative Reformed online world, there's just a lot more people. Like we exist in a very tiny, tiny little fraction of the Christian sphere, let alone the just general populace. And what you see right now, we've talked about, is you have this move from people like in the Gospel Coalition to broaden, and to maybe move more toward perhaps try to get more involved in some of the Anglican world. I know our friends over at the Presbycast have mentioned that they think they're really going to try to go after the more conservative Methodists and target them a little bit more for readership. We know that they've been making some inroads with more of the charismatic world. Obviously, our good friend who our good friend Charlie Self.
That's right.
Shout out to Charlie. Is Assemblies of God, and he's writing quite a bit for them. Which, by the way, I interestingly found out. I maybe mentioned this, but according to our stated clerk in the PCA, the only two denominations in the U.S. that are continuing to grow right now are the PCA and the Assemblies of God. Those are the only denominations in the United States that have a net growth over the last couple years, I believe. So it's just an interesting fact. And I don't know what the numbers are at the Assemblies of God, but my assumption is that it's bigger than the PCA. I don't actually know if that's the case. But anyway, so like, in other words, these groups that, yes, we maybe will, would say we don't trust them anymore. They're making pretty significant inroads in some ways into other aspects of evangelicalism, other elements of evangelicalism that maybe we just don't have the same connection to, and we don't see as much.
And that would be actually, because I doubt that's happening, but obviously I don't have the experience to know if they're actually succeeding. It would be fascinating to know if they're succeeding or not.
Yeah, and I really don't know either. That's why
right.
I'm a little bit cagey in my answer.
Now, what I want to clarify is, so I think obviously Stephen Wolfe's targeting is on the young, restless, and reform leaders, right? He lists Mark Dever, Ligon Duncan, Albert Mohler, C.J. Mahaney, John MacArthur, John Piper, right? Like he's listing the young, restless, and reformed. Now, I want to add a little more of that restless context, because there's one thing I want to be clear, that when you and I use the term Big Eva, we actually don't mean the exact same thing as what he's talking about. And I actually think there's another way to use the term evangelical elite that I want to look into, at least for a moment, and to decide if that's also kind of gone. And it's got a lot of overlap with what he meant, but it's a little bit different. So Big Eva, and actually, interestingly, both of these terms, Big Eva and evangelical elite, were both used by Carl Trueman much earlier than anyone else used either of them.
That's
and
right.
He does not use them as the same term.
No.
So I don't know if he coined the term evangelical elite. He did coin Big Eva. But however, that
I'll give it to him.
Yep. And he uses them differently. So let me give his description of Big Eva and then the cultural evangelical elite. And Pastor Michael, after I do each one, why don't you kind of tell me how this is a little different than what Wolfe is describing? Because I think something people need to know is, when we say the evangelical elite are falling, both either YRR or generally, we do not mean Big Eva is falling, because I don't think that's currently the case.
No.
So Big Eva, this is Carl Trueman from a famous blog post he wrote on this. This is my term for the large network of evangelical organizations and conferences that seek to shape the thinking and strategy of American evangelical churches. What Big Eva has done is to create an economy of power, people, and indeed money, which is non-ecclesiastical but highly influential within evangelical churches. It is a populist movement of tremendous influence and minimal accountability. And because it promises rewards to individuals, organizations, influence, students, and platform, it is very hard to criticize and functionally unaccountable to anything but itself. So how is that different than this group of the evangelical elite who Wolfe thinks has fallen, at least from where they were before?
Yeah. So the number one thing is, obviously, it's not limited to actually just people, right? So the evangelical elite it's particular people who hold places of influence and power within various evangelical spheres. In Wolfe's article, most particularly within the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. Like that is the center. So it's personalities particularly. Whereas when we're talking about Big Eva, it's a lot more than just a handful of personalities. It's all of the, I mean, it is the mega church movement. It is the seeker sensitive movement. It's so much tied to that. It's the conference circuits that even though, maybe T4G is no more, it's no longer together, but that was not the only conference in the world that's going on that's, building up certain personalities, but also, and I'd like to hear you talk more about this because you were mentioning something before we started recording that I think is just right. It's kind of dead on. But also, when Wolfe is talking about the evangelical elite, I think that he's really emphasizing the political influence that certain evangelical leaders had, and looking at it through that lens, as opposed to the influence that they had, for instance, as a great preacher or an author of many books on different Christian topics. He's coming at it from this different vantage point.
Yeah, that is something we're going to talk about in a second. This idea that Wolfe specific interest, and again, if you've heard him on our show, right, we've discussed with him Two Kingdoms theology, and we've discussed his book that
which now that everybody has very strong opinions about Stephen Wolfe, I'm always in this position of basically defending him, but not even as I'll be in groups of people and people have very strong opinions, sometimes very negative opinions about Stephen Wolfe, but he's only ever been super kind with his time and conversation with us, right?
Yep.
And we haven't maybe discussed every thing he believes or something, but he's only ever been a nice conversation partner that we met online before he wrote this book, way before he got
the first time we talked to him, he mentioned, I'm writing this huge book that will be very long, and I don't know how interesting it will be to a broad audience.
Yeah.
Well, oh boy.
Well, you done okay.
Lucky
as
man,
far as
you hit it at the right moment. Yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah.
And
So anyway, I always end up in this position where I'm like, oh, he's only ever been a pretty nice guy to me. So I'm not going to say anything negative about him, even if I don't agree with everything he says. And then people look at me as though I'm the bad guy.
You are the bad guy.
I'm wearing a black t-shirt.
This Monday, a few days ago, we released a Patreon episode discussing if our podcast is unknowingly part of a conspiracy to take down the United States of America. And it is somewhat related to this. So you can you can subscribe for $3 a month and join us, where we did have content coming out, at least even on our hiatus. So, but yeah, Big Eva is this idea of it's the money machine. It's the production system, right? And so there is the mega church, right? The YRR certainly was a part of it when that was selling the books, creating the conferences. And so obviously at the time when Carl Trueman is writing this, he's writing that the goal is to get on a conference circuit, and then these conferences, there's no one they can hold accountable to. And so he writes about the problems of maybe woke things or revoice, because these are just totally unaccountable and there's nothing we can really do because there's no church connection to any of this. Now, Carl Trueman's definition of the evangelical elite is this idea of these are the institutional leaders in the Christian church. They're the leadership class associated with institutions. And in many ways, they are at least in some way related to the cultural elites in the West more broadly. And so he makes some comments about it. The Christian elites try to persuade often the secular world that they aren't so bad in terms of their enlightenment conceptions of reasons. Where possible, sometimes it means they have to lay blame for Christianity's failures to meet their standards on other Christians, and that they, the good Christians, these people are beneath them economically and socially. Right now, he's getting into more of the elitism. Like Schleiermacher and others, they will sneer at the fundamentalist masses, the class division in American society where there is the educated people and the low information people. And this is found where it should never be, in the body of Christian believers. So this I think is a very helpful definition. This is Truman's definition of the evangelical elite. Now, here's my question, Pastor Michael. Has this kind of evangelical elite fallen? This elite that is related to the secular elite that kind of views itself as above the average Christian?
It fallen in the sense that people do not trust them. Just like I said before, this is true culturally of most elites, period. That fallen in the sense that they do not have the same respect, the same kind of automatic trust anymore that they once did. But some of these guys are still very connected to those places of governmental power. I mean, you think about this, relationship still within the, the circles of, Russell Moore, Francis Collins, those sorts of things. I mean, they're still there. They still have connection. I don't know if it's, I would doubt that it is, more influence than before. My guess is that it is less influence than before. But I am not sure that it has actually fallen completely.
Now, the only reason I think it is interesting, I do think it would exist because institutional leadership will always exist. But what I wonder is, at this point, my question is is there really any actual connection or influence they have with the secular elite? That would be
I don't know. Right.
That would be the actual answer to this question. Yeah. And
I mean, Francis Collins clearly did, right? And I don't know if he still does, but he clearly was deeply connected in a lot of ways. And there was that deep connection between him, Russell Moore, Tim Keller, others. And so you at least have that much of a connection. I don't know how much influence that is, but it's a connection.
And he's the perfect example of why everyone hates this.
Yep.
Because
exactly.
Because this is what Wolfe starts to track. He starts to track that what we saw was people hopping off when people started seeing woke signaling and then certain COVID things. And then by the end, everyone was left. Now, what Wolfe really tracks, as Michael was saying, is the kind of political landscape that was occurring. And that he kind of tracks, and he gets to this, really what they did in the culture is that they were using the political world as a place to witness, right? And so that means if we can take cause with people who have racial, grievances, can we use that as a place to witness? Can we get faithful presence in other places? Can we show that the gospel gives us a third way, right? One of the things he says, and this is, again, I think this will bring me to my maybe one of the kind of the slight beefs I have with this article, a mild critique of it is, he says, under Keller's influence, the YRR was not retreatist, but activist, pursuing cultural engagement, true, demonstrating that the Orthodox faith is a key to a coherent, good, and complete life. That, I think, is actually what was happening. And what you will notice, which is not true of the rest of his article, what I just read, none of that is actually political. This is what I think the YRR was doing. The YRR was in this postmodern world, in this place where there was a lot of distrust to evangelicalism in general. These men were trying to say, no, Orthodox Christianity is coherent. And so they introduced the Reformed intellect from the ages past. It's good, and you need it to complete your life.
Yeah.
And again, we see that on a popular level. Mark Driscoll's going to tell you how to be a man and have a family, right? Tim Keller on this kind of heady, going to discuss things with the urban people of New York, right? He's going to make these kinds of cases. And you have all these other kinds of things. And so the YRR was very intellectually interested. But what I think, as we look back, Stephen Wolfe is looking back with a political interest. And I think, I don't know if he knows this, but his article doesn't reflect this. The YRR was not fundamentally political, nor were any of us interested in politics at the time. That was not a question that was being asked. And so I don't know that it was actually an issue of like, our politics went wrong, the like thing.
Yeah.
But because what we were around was this gospel-centered reform theology, not this more broad idea, there was no interest in it. It wasn't part of it. And so actually what happened are, I think, two things. As we grew in believing that the faith was part of a coherent, good, and complete life, eventually you have to confront the fact that politics is part of that life.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and this is where he does, I think he's right, that he talks about when he was in 2008, he was at T4G, and he talks about the differences on the panels that he watched when it came to politics and questions about politics, where some were more cultural, kind of into cultural engagement. Some, he points out John Piper's pacifism and John MacArthur being there, and obviously he being one who is pretty skeptical of any kind of work within the governmental sphere, critical of the American Revolution and anything like that. So he points out that all of these guys, despite having very different views, all sit on the same panel. He points out that this is in some sense because they were right in the middle of the neutral world, as Aaron Wrenn talks about it, and so they could see those things as kind of indifferent. They could disagree about those things and it not really be a big deal because they were not front and center. And that actually then, as we move into a more hostile culture, especially a hostility coming from the government, right? Coming from the secular elites with political power, all of a sudden those questions of political engagement take on a whole new level of importance.
Right. And I think that the things that held the Gospel Coalition and those kinds of movements together, for example, COVID, the woke things, these are the things that showed there was in no way a broad agreement on any of those things.
Right.
And so I think it's more of something that was overlooked than wrong. Because another thing he points out, that the target engagement of TGC and neo-Calvinist apologetics in general has always been urbanites, or at least non-rural residents. Few talk about the need to minister to rural and working class whites. And I believe he is correct about that. But again, I don't believe it's because they necessarily don't like those people. The reason I believe is because, again, when this was at its zenith in 2008, we kind of assumed those areas were pretty reached. Tim Keller was promoted because, holy cow, how's he doing this in New York City?
Yeah.
Right? The idea that there were lots of churches in small towns wasn't considered a wild thing. I don't know. I need to look this up. What year did the book Hillbilly Elegy come out?
Sure. Super interesting book if you've not read it.
Great book. But I think that book by J.D. Vance, the book came out in 2016. And I really think, at least for me personally.
Was that in 2016?
The book did, yeah. And the book,
I thought it was before that.
It came out, right. So that's out 8 years after the zenith of the Young, Restless, and Reformed. And I think that book and a lot of things around that time frame are really what began to show small town America is deeply broken and needs a missionary encounter so badly. Now, I agree the things the YRR was doing were not going to easily translate to any of those places. But again, they were formed, and Wolfe, and this is another thing, and we may come back to this, Wolfe points out how they were forming steam for this thing since the 80s. By 2008, by 2016, they're kind of a finished product. John Piper lives in downtown Minneapolis, and that's what he cares about, and that's what forms him, right? The Redeemer church plants in New York City are big, and they're going to do their thing, right? The idea that they are now going to begin talking about the issues of Appalachia would be strange, right? And I just think that a lot of the things that have come to the surface are just new. And these men are pretty old now. I mean, Dr. Keller has passed away, right? This is like, there is a time we're a little bit outside of the YRR is gone, even if it feels like online it is. Now, Pastor Michael, let me explain one thing. Here's why I think this article may have been written and why there is some, we'll call it, pain around this article. Because this article is announcing the positions of influence, everybody, are up for grabs. And while I don't think Stephen Wolfe is one of them, I think he's primarily an academic. I think everyone knows there are certain young men, or at least younger ministries, angling to assume these kinds of positions amongst us.
Yeah.
And that's and that feeling means if the guys you don't like so much from the other parts of the YRR or the Reformed world or the niche within a niche within a niche, if they get those positions, that puts you in a feeling unhappy position. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I do agree. I think Stephen is more of an academic, but he is also very Stephen is I believe he's very tactical in almost everything that he writes, and the reason he writes the things he does. You may disagree with his tactics, but I think that almost everything he does for a very particular purpose, right? Yeah. And I think that's what he's doing even in this article, as far as not just announcing that they're up for grabs, but I do think probably, leaning in one particular direction. Well, so for instance,
do you want to read the last two? Read the last two paragraphs, because I think that is where that's his application to what up until that point is just the history of the YRR.
Yep. So here is the last two paragraphs of the article, if you haven't read it, or even if you're going to read it now. The energy in American evangelicalism is now on the Christian right, who have become emboldened in their efforts to return America to its heritage of faith. They affirm the goodness of Christian nations, an assertive Christian politics, and the predominant heritage of faith in American history. For them, Christian politics is not loser theology, nor meant only to carve out a safe existence for churches. The goal is the complete re-Christianization of civil society, institutions, and government. The moderate wing of YRR, represented by such pastors as Kevin DeYoung, want to reaffirm a center, quote unquote, amid this chaos. But that is pure nostalgia for a neutral world that no longer exists and which will never return. In our age of secularist hostility, you must decide whether Drag Queen Story Hour is a blessing of liberty or a license to be destroyed, whether you want pagan nationalism or Christian nationalism, whether degeneracy or righteousness will prevail, and whether Satan or the Lord Jesus will rule over this land.
Shout out to David French. Probably would not be the best interview if you were on our show. But as far as it goes, Pastor Michael, here's my question. His statement, and with how he explains what the Christian right is, do you believe the energy is now with the Christian right in American evangelicalism?
I think at least in part. I mean, I think so. I think that there is at least a groundswell right now of support. And the reason I say that in part is because I see now kind of run-of-the-mill Christian leaders, local pastors. Obviously, we see it, for instance, in figures like Mark Driscoll, who we talk about a lot, especially in our Patreon, with the kinds of sermons that he's been preaching and what he's been doing, the way he's been positioning himself politically. There seems to me a clear move by a lot of men who at least think that the energy, the support, the movement is all with those on the right. There is not as much signaling to those on the left. Whereas, again, if we go back to, for instance, the late Tim Keller, there was clearly this move to try to position yourself, yes, in a third way, but in a way that would make Christianity sound more appealing to urban progressives.
Mm.
That does not seem near as common. It's not that it doesn't happen. It just seems like there is much more willingness to kind of signal to the right instead.
Yeah. Now, all right. So I'm going to say, because Mark Driscoll is such a smooth operator, that is the only thing that makes me think the answer might be yes. Now, again, I grant Stephen Wolfe, Mark Driscoll, they're probably both smarter than me.
By the way, I see that. So even locally, I can think of think of one particular church that I would not think of as a conservative right wing type church, very much in a big Eva kind of mentality, and yet there seems to be an interest in being engaged in certain aspects of the culture war from a right perspective. From the perspective of the right is what I mean by saying that. I know that could be confusing how I said it. From the perspective of the right, in a way that I would not have expected, say 8 years ago. I just wouldn't have expected it at all. And so I'm seeing that on the ground on a local level as well.
And now Pastor Michael and I live close to each other, but I do live in a more progressive town. So again, so if my local experience is different, it's that I just only see this online. Now, what I could believe is that we are living in a time where the Tim Keller hope of can you communicate across that is not really an option anymore. And so it at least seems like we're more right wing because we've kind of accepted when I preach, if I have to apply something on abortion or things on the family, half of the country is going to hate me. And there's just it doesn't matter how I say it. And it doesn't mean I'm going to say it based on my personality as aggressive as I can. I just know no matter what. And so what I might as well do is do it in a way that will actually encourage those who don't hate me.
Yeah.
Now, can I offer one piece of free advice to the people trying to assume these positions of influence, Pastor Michael?
Yeah, let's hear it, Matt.
And then I have some free advice for our listeners, and then I have a question that I wonder, and I'm probably going to be told no, it's not possible. So, my first one: if you are a person trying to assume one of these positions, let's take a moment and reflect on the fact that at the beginning of Stephen Wolfe's article, he said they started working towards this in the 1980s. So I think it is going to look, I think people are going to react pretty badly if you, with an online following, even if it's rather large, say, I'm the captain now, right? Like you at in your 30s, you with a pretty young ministry, again, from let's say 1988 to 2008. Right? That was 20 years of development of the YRR, of the groundwork, of the relationship building, of the writing, of the thinking, of the praying, of the actual fruitful ministry. And probably if there are older Christians around you that find you obnoxious, it's because you haven't built that kind of credibility or those institutions yet like these men did.
Are you saying, Matt, that the Restless podcast, given that we are, how long have we been going? 3 years, 2.5 years?
About 3, almost.
Are you saying that we are not
we are not in the
Evangelical Elite?
No, we are hoping to be in the running for the Car Talk Radio of the of whatever the new thing is, where you stop by for this. That's my free advice to them.
Yeah.
My free advice to everyone else who cares about, who's realized this this Christian life that makes you complete, that is coherent, that is a good life. It's time to admit it does include the political life. And there are Orthodox Christian positions on the political life. And they are found, for example, in the Reformed confessions.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But they are not included necessarily in a specific current political cause.
Yeah.
Because again, those things could divide us. And in fact, Christians have at times reflected on, what does it mean that I might be in a war where I might kill another Christian over a political cause, right?
Yeah.
But that again, I'm not convinced, even if there's energy for this, like if those of us bookish reformed guys, because that's who we are, we're part of the bookish reformed guy crowd. You know what we could do if there really is energy on the political in the right? We could say, hey, here are the orthodox positions we should rally around, and let people go do their thing and just keep holding to that and make that a feature. That would be my free advice to the kinds of people who listen to our podcast. What do you think about that free advice?
Yeah, I love it. I really do. And part of it is I love it. It's not uncommon for people to ask me like my thoughts on politics and what Christians should be doing in the political world. And one of my answers is I have a lot of opinions. We talk about it here. We've talked about it during the TGC debates. I mean, I have plenty of opinions and thoughts. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, my role in the world is as a pastor and to administer the sacraments and preach the word. And so I want to be at work discipling the kinds of people that are going to have to be in those positions, those specific political positions of influence. But there's this kind of desire right now, I think, for pastors to be everything, both from pastors and from congregants, right? And part of that is understandable because we're looking for leadership. We're looking for leaders. And I want to be the kind of man that people look to for those kinds of answers, right? I want to be the kind of man who is so stable and has such a solid home life and has clearly taken on responsibility and sought to glorify God in it, that people do come to me for help. People do come to me because they want me to, in some sense, influence them. But part of my role then as a pastor, I think, is going to have to be, I can't answer all of these questions for you. I have opinions, but we can't, I am just not, it is not my sphere to be doing a lot of that kind of work. And if I focus on that, I just can't do what I have been called to do well. And so anyway, I do think that one thing that you could do if you're in that position, or even just in the position of a Christian who's like, hey, I'm not going to be in leadership in these places, but I know people maybe who are or who are interested in it. You do have the opportunity to point them to what our historic confessions say about the role of the deacon of God.
That's right. Now here's my final question, Pastor Michael. Can there be a future? Because again, right, what these people who are assuming the cultural elite are doing, like trying to assume these positions, is the future of what we're going to be doing in the church is going to look a lot the same. There'll be conferences, there'll be names, there'll be people we all listen to. And so the best thing to do is we're playing we're playing musical chairs. So get in a chair while they're still open. Or find your tribe, or whatever you want to say. Is there a future? Can I imagine a future where there isn't an evangelical elite? Where what we primarily have are potent local forces, where pastors produce whatever fueled by their own personal ministry, they are putting out and creating things that would actually be useful to their congregation. And thus, that probably will have wider use, but it's focused on the specific questions you might be asking, right? Maybe your people do have specific questions. I'm answering specific questions on the Trinity, right? There are all these different opportunities we have, but is there a possibility where it becomes, I don't know what the right word is, decentralized? And not that, because again, the problem is what happens a lot of these things is pastors in the work of pastoring eventually kind of get comfortable giving pat answers. And so then what happens is people go, well, I'm going to go find someone who will give me an answer that goes beyond this. But if this high, right, like, Truman in his article on the Evangelical Elites talks about how bad elitism is and how bad it is to be lazy about the scholarship and work that actually we should care about, that often characterizes the elite. And my question is there a future, is there a possible future where we don't have an elite like that anymore? Where what we actually have are decentralized of local things. And this is probably a weird place to end it because it's a pure thought experiment.
It is.
And I assume the answer is no, and that's okay if it is.
Yeah, I don't know how I could possibly know that. But let me just, that has never stopped me before. And so let me take a little stab. I don't know, but I can hope that at least there is a shift. I think that probably in a super connected world with the kinds of social media and things that we have, with things like YouTube and podcasting and all of this, there's always going to be a certain kind of an elite that has a broader influence. But my hope is that basically what happens is that we realign to having a kind of elite that rises according to how God typically desires for men to arise into places of influence and authority, which is not just by some kind of sophistry and getting a large kind of democratic audience, like we just, democratic in that, not in the necessarily just purely political term, but meaning just like you're just getting a wide amount of people that are interested in listening to you, which is what propels you up into some kind of influence and fame. My hope is that basically what you're saying would be at least partially true. And what would happen is that over time, men who show themselves faithful on a local level, in their homes, right, with their children, that they be the kinds of people that are slowly allowed to become the kind of elite that we really need. Because I don't think you can get away from the elite. I do think that it is inevitable to have a kind of elite, almost a kind of aristocracy. But I want those to be actually good men, right? Men who are actually faithful. That is what I would desire. I don't know if we will get that, at least not apart from massive repentance. But I hope even if we won't get that on a broader level, each of us would take that and say, okay, I want to be the kind of person that God has called me to be. And I want to gain influence and authority as he has set up the world to most naturally work, which is slowly and carefully as you are faithful in your given context and given sphere.
Amen. Pastor your people, be faithful with little, serve Christ, everybody. Pastor Michael, we're so back. This has been the Restless Podcast.
We're so back.
The Restless Podcast, broadcasting here from the ashes of the young, restless, and reformed. Happily. So rate and review this show. Join us next Monday, 8 p.m., the 18th of September, when we will review a debate on postmillennialism and amillennialism. And eschatology was just the friends we made along the way, everybody.